Yeah, it should probably go without saying that we're not sponsored by anybody, because they'd be expecting a certain level of production quality, I imagine, if we were. Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to really think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Christopher Such.
Hello again.
And Neil Almond.
Hello.
And together, we're going to explore subject knowledge, and in particular, places to go when trying to improve our own subject knowledge in different disciplines we have to teach at primary. But first, Chris, what you reading for?
Hey, what you reading for?
Full disclosure, this week I'm still reading Newman and Dickinson's Handbook of Early Literacy Research, and I will be for some time. So I'm going to recommend something I've been watching and listening to casually. There is a YouTube account called Veritasium from America that makes wonderful videos relating to science, engineering, and mathematics, and the overlap of those three, of course. If you are interested in that kind of stuff at all, I would really recommend you start with a video called This Equation Will Change How You See the World. Yes, it's a bit of a clickbait title, but you don't get millions of followers without that, I'd imagine. But look past that to the content of the videos, and what you end up with is the sort of in-depth view of science, mathematics, and engineering that BBC4 can only dream of. It's, top stuff. What about you, Neil? What are you reading for?
So I'm coming back to and revisiting David Didow's Making Meaning in English, exploring the role of knowledge in the English curriculum. The reason for me, first of all, starting that one is because I found out over the summer that I was going to be leading English in my current role, and I appreciate the work that David Didow has done, and I think he's a very good writer. And so I'd be and him being an English teacher himself, I was very interested to kind of go to a piece of writing that he had done, in this case, this book, that really kind of focuses on that subject, and thinking about how the argument in that book is that English isn't a sort of skills subject. It is a knowledge. It is something that can fit in with this knowledge-rich category, if you like. And while there's not too much there, perhaps for your Key Stage 1 or even lower Key Stage 2, he has a particularly excellent chapter on metaphor and how it is that you might go about introducing and teaching metaphor, and how you might make sure that students make meaning from particular metaphor, which is a really kind of fascinating idea, something that, and it's something that starts to be talked about within year 5, year 6. So if teachers are looking for a really interesting 40-page idea of what a good metaphor is and what good teaching of metaphor looks like, I really recommend this book, and particularly that chapter on metaphor. Kieran, what are you reading for?
So I've been reading a really interesting book, and it's one that I thought I would one day write, but the more I've read it, the more I realize I don't need to write the book I thought I wanted to write. And it's called Becoming Fluent: How Cognitive Science Can Help Adults Learn a Foreign Language. And it is brilliant, knowing cognitive science the way we do, and having read a lot of the original papers. What it's Richard Roberts and Roger Kreutz have done is make cognitive science really accessible to the lay reader, and show people how best they can spend their time and how they can overcome all the biases that are working against us as adults when we're trying to learn something that many, many people try and fail each year, learning another language that isn't necessarily spoken in the area in which we live. And I hope that one day I could take all my learning about cognitive science and turn it into a fantastic book. But actually, I realized I don't need to do that anymore, because these guys have done a wonderful job doing that. And it's really interesting, and it's motivating, because just when you think you're in a bit of a habit, you can get a bump and go, oh, actually I could try that, or I could try this. This is my next step in terms of being the most efficient language learner I can possibly be. And I think the same applies for teaching. And so I think there are a lot of parallels that we could use as well. So this week, we're going to explore subject knowledge, try really hard not to cover all ground because we do quite like to talk about places people should go. But I think if we run through lots of the subjects, if possibly them all, that we expect our pupils to learn about in primary, and maybe look at, places where we can go to find out more. For instance, if you're like me, who arrives in England, never having studied the tutors, but expected to teach year 5 about the tutors, where am I going? That kind of situation. So I think probably makes sense to start with reading because I'm talking to Chris and Neil. Where are you guys going for subject knowledge in terms of reading?
As you say, trying not to cover old ground here. So I'm not going to talk about the aspects of reading that relate to how we might teach fluency or this sort of thing. But in terms of children's literature and picture books that might inspire writing as well, and this sort of thing, you'd be hard pushed to find a more comprehensive set of resources than Simon Smith's blogs. Any time where I'm struggling to find a book to inspire year 3, year 4, year 5, year 6, or if a teacher comes to me and says, what kind of book can I use in year 1 to do X, Y, and Z? I'm often saying, go to Simon Smith's blogs. There are a few people who know their way around children's literature like he does. So yeah, definitely one to check out there.
Yeah, just to add on to that one, I'd like to say that Duke Skywalker, who's at Carl Duke 8, he's also another really good person who really knows his way around children's literature, which I'm the first to say is a complete kind of gap in my schema. So as I say, between Simon Smith and Duke Skywalker, he's curated, I think, quite a few Google Docs or Google slides of books that link to particular curriculum subject areas. They're all free. They're all on his Twitter. I can even see it's one of his pinned tweets and it's the hashtag curriculum books. It's a wonderful resource and one that whenever I look at texts that might support a particular area of history or geography or whatever it might be that we're looking at, it's definitely one that I always go to.
I think those are really important because we don't have time to read everything we'd like to. And if someone has curated, I think that's invaluable because then it allows you to place your trust in someone who has done a lot of the legwork for you. So I think, you can't really understate how important that is, particularly, the more time poor a teacher is. I reckon probably the further down the list, reading books that you want to cover with your class will go.
Yeah, one of the great things about the blogs in question from Simon Smith are the fact that for each book, there's just a quick summary of what it does, what it includes, what kind of audience it might be suitable for, what children are likely to get from it. It's, those little descriptions is just enough, a bit of a teaser for you as a teacher, but enough for you to understand whether this is going to be suitable for your class, whether it is too similar to something you've read before. So yeah, well worth checking out.
So the next one's not so easy because we've spent quite a lot of time talking about it on the podcast. Where are you guys going for your mathematics subject knowledge?
So it'd be remiss of me to not mention that one place that is absolutely fantastic for the time poor teacher, but to really get a good understanding of subject knowledge, but also some of the underlining principles as to why this particular piece of subject knowledge is important, is Shannon Doherty's 100 Ideas for Primary Maths Teachers. It's just a fantastic kind of, you can hold it in the palm of your hand, you can carry it around with you in a backpack quite easily, and you can pick something out of it almost straight away that is going to enhance your own subject knowledge, but equally really show you how you can then make that come alive in the classroom.
Bit of an out there suggestion from me. It's one that I hadn't really considered until someone recommended it to me recently. Teacher who I know who struggled with mathematics when they were a trainee, not so much because they'd ever struggled with it massively in the past, but it'd been a while since they had studied at GCSE and obviously at primary school before that. And they said one of the things they did just to really sharpen their subject knowledge, getting back to where they were the use of CGP revision guides for Key Stage 2. They just said they went through that, checked they could answer every question. It just reminded them of how much they did remember and which bits and pieces they didn't, so they could dive in a bit further. So I actually think from taking that as a recommendation and having had a bit of a flick through one of those revision guides since, I do think they're a pretty useful and cheap way to get back into where you're thinking of where you need to be with your subject knowledge. We've obviously talked about the work of Derek Haylock before. I've got to say it, tackling misconceptions or more mackling misconceptions, I prefer. Sorry, couldn't resist the spoonerism. Obviously, Kieran Mackel's books are superb. I've talked about thinking deeply about primary mathematics quite a lot, and so I think maybe I've not given that one the attention it deserves. So that's certainly one to check out. Equally, I think Oak National Academy, the videos that are on there are a useful resource for teachers who want things explaining, for teachers who, maybe it's just one part of the mathematics curriculum that you're not quite so confident with. It might be equivalent fractions, it might be lowest common multiple, whatever it is, you'll be able to find a video on it from an experienced teacher talking it through. So why would you not use that? It's free, it's still there. Yeah, I would check that out for sure.
Yeah, there's another one by Derek Haylock as well. It's about misconceptions as well, which clearly isn't as good as Kieran Mackel's, but it's I remember it's one of those few. Derek Haylock is one of those few texts that I was recommended reading while I was in training to be a teacher during my 3-year BA, and yeah, those two are certainly ones that I've obviously stuck in my mind. So although I've been perhaps a little bit harsh towards my education of training to be a teacher, certainly, those two books came into my life at a time perhaps when I probably didn't appreciate it as much as I should have done. But they've obviously made a lasting impact because I can still remember clearly seeing those two on the recommended reading list and reading them as well.
I'm not sure you can say that. I think Derek Haylock and it's Ralph Manning, isn't it? The co-author. I think their work's unsurpassed in terms of primary mathematics. And if I can even get anywhere close to sort of their output, then I'll be happy. And I think a lot of us being able to inspire wonder and awe in mathematics is finding the awe and wonder ourselves. And there's probably nobody better for doing that for adults than Marcus de Sautoy, who is, he took over from Richard Dawkins as the emeritus professor for public science, making science accessible to the public, something along those lines. And his two most recent books, and you're talking 4 or 5 years since the oldest of them, What We Cannot Know and The Creativity Code. And essentially what he does is he takes his background in mathematics and looks at things like AI. In The Creativity Code, he looks at the story of Deep Blue and uses those sort of examples to show us what the future might hold. And in What We Cannot Know, he looks at the limitations of science. But I think in terms of finding sources of inspiration, you can't go far. So I know it's not precisely what we'll teach in primary school, but a lot of the exposition, for instance, in tackling misconceptions, there's talk of the computer that worked out the largest prime number and the fact that there's $1 million prize for working out the next prime number because of how important it is with cybersecurity, because those long drawn out prime numbers are really, really difficult for computers to crack. Or, I don't completely understand, but I know it took many, many hours. And in the old days, they used to put many computers together, as many as 50 computers hooked up together, running these numbers for ages and ages and ages. And, I love that kind of stuff. And I love bringing it into the classroom, because then when our pupils ask, well, why do we need to know about prime numbers? Well, there's reason number one, it will ensure that your financial security, remains such. And so I'm definitely going to Marcus de Sautoy for anything in terms of in terms of awe and wonder in mathematics. What about grammar? Where would you go to, Chris?
I've always been a bit of a fan of Strunk and White's The Elements of Style. I know it's a bit dated, and I know that some of the advice in there is, just old-fashioned, frankly. But ever since my secondary English teacher told me that I used 50 words when 5 would do, I've been trying my best to be succinct in writing, and nothing supported me in that as much as Strunk and White. But beyond that, beyond its good advice about writing, it also has some really sensible, understandable rules for dealing with things like comma splices, semicolons. Again, the advice in a lot of cases is stated as if this is definitely the way it is, whereas in some cases it's actually just a stylistic preference. But mostly you're on really solid ground with the advice it gives on grammar. In terms of the grammatical terminology that we need to understand in school, there's also a book, I think, called The Grammar Book by Zoe and Timothy Paramore. I've not read it myself, but I've seen it recommended by people that I trust. So that's almost certainly one to check out. And perhaps a little bit of a left field suggestion here. Often when I've been on Google or YouTube and I'm looking for decent explanations for things like the past progressive or whatever it might be, I often end up with videos that, if I look down at the bottom where it says the title, they're actually by the British Council, and they're meant for people who are learning English, say, as a second language. A lot of those resources are really carefully thought through, really carefully structured, and really succinctly explained. So I would maybe check out the free courses that you can do online through the British Council relating to, I think they're actually divided up into like grammar, vocabulary, etc. So yeah, definitely give them a look.
I've just got 2 to add, and they're both part of a DK series. There's English for Everyone, the English Grammar Guide, which is a comprehensive visual reference guide just to different particular aspects of grammar, which I've found particularly useful. All very clear, succinct, no jargon bar the actual grammatical terms that are used, clear diagrams that teachers could easily take a picture of on their phone, crop it, send it to themselves using a grammar lesson, or if you buy the ebook, just potentially copyright law prevailing, snip it and put it in a presentation, and obviously, referencing where appropriate. And then linked to that one then is the visual guide to grammar and punctuation. This one is kind of more based towards children itself, but it's something that is still effective, I think, for teachers to dip in and out of, just to kind of really see. It goes from the building blocks of what a sentence is. It looks at a whole range of different ideas, from the difference between a collective noun and a proper noun. It goes through what some common misconceptions that children might make when it comes to grammar. So things like using the wrong kind of there, or using is an R incorrectly when talking about singular or plural. So those are great books that, if you're time poor and you just really want to have a visual reference guide with you, I think they are particularly strong contenders to be in every classroom.
For grammar, for me, I'm going to recommend something, the first of a few, because I don't know, people who've listened to many of the episodes may have heard me talking about how I use Audible, and I'm quite fond of listening to audiobooks, 1.5 speed. And what I do to get the most of my Audible subscription, and I'm not sponsored by them or anything, is I will use a thing called the Great Courses. And essentially, it's this old, I think some of them are quite modern, so it's been going for a long time though, set of, it says the best classrooms in the world. So you go like Harvard or MIT for your science lessons, and basically they'll take you through a course that some university lecturer has put on. And there's a guy called John McVorter who actually, in his courses, talks about Strunk and White and the conversation that is taking place as to proper use of language. And the one for this it's called Myths and Lies and Half-Truths of Language Usage. And basically, he spends 30 hours or 20 hours if you're on 1.5-ish speed, talking about the history of language usage and the proprieties of language usage as we see them now in the 21st century. And yeah, so for someone like me who doesn't necessarily have the time to dedicate reading time to English and the teaching of English, I'll stick that on the car when there's no one else in it, or I'll use it as I'm walking between my schools, and get through a course a week sometimes. And yeah, so I'm going to signpost a few of my favorites, but it's called the Great Courses, and I think you can subscribe from them themselves, but a lot of their things are already on Audible, and $7.99 a month for 30 odd hours of content, I think it's decent. But like I said, not sponsored by the Great Courses.
A couple of other things for those of you interested in getting into language and perhaps doing some writing of your own, and you're the sort like me, you find yourself worrying whether a given word is not just grammatically correct, or whether it has the meaning you want it to have. If you're the person who gets compliment mixed up with compliment, or tenet and tenant, those two are very common. I'd recommend both the Reader's Digest, The Right Word at the Right Time, which is actually just a really interesting read. It's one of these ones, it's set up A to Z. You can just plow through it and realize how little you know about the language and how interesting the language is. Also, Fowler's Modern English Usage is a really handy reference guide. I find that has helped me countless times when I'm trying to sharpen up on my writing. And I've no doubt that it would actually be a pretty useful resource generally for primary teachers.
So what about history then? Where are you going to, Neil, whenever you want to develop your history subject knowledge?
So obviously it depends what area of history that you're particularly interested in, that you're looking at. For British history, which a large chunk of the national curriculum is, I really enjoy a YouTube channel called 10-Minute Histories, and it does exactly what it says in the book. It takes you from pretty much the arrival of the Romans up into the modern day in kind of 10-minute chunks. I remember spending a large proportion of lockdown quite happily watching those with particularly silly animations. You probably goes at a pace that's probably too fast to actually watch them with the children, but they are kind of a fantastic way to just kind of get a succinct idea. So as you mentioned, where do I start with the Tudors if your curriculum isn't explicit enough in what you should teach? Then certainly, finding 1485 and the Battle of Bosworth and following that on for a couple of episodes is a great place to start. If you have some sort of Apple device, because I'm not sure if it's there on Android, there is an author called Henry Freeman, and he has some free books on various aspects of history that coincidentally fall into certain aspects of the national curriculum as well. So there's a really, really good one on the Maya. There's another exceptional one on the Sumeria. They're only probably about 50 pages in length. So really short, really succinct, and they're free as well. And yeah, there's plenty for the subject, for the amount of knowledge that a primary school teacher would be looking for. I think they hit the nail on the head pretty well, to be honest.
I think one of the hardest parts of teaching history as a primary teacher is how helpful it is, and yet how difficult it is to have an overview of history itself. I mean, that's a difficult thing for anyone, never mind a primary teacher. And any text that attempts to give an overview of world history is inevitably going to have biases and weaknesses. And yet, I think it's still valuable to read a text or two that attempt to do that. One of the most accessible texts that does that, one admittedly with a European focus, is A Little History of the World by E.H. Gombrich. It's a classic, and by that I mean it's wonderful but dated. Alongside that, I think the cheat sheets that are available on Michael Tidd's blog are really useful for aspects of the national curriculum with which teachers might not be particularly familiar. And I guess obvious recommendation, but the History Association is a fine place to start, assuming your school subscribes to it. And if they don't, perhaps consider trying to convince your school to do so, because it isn't particularly expensive and there are some really good bits and pieces on there.
Just one more to add in there very quickly. DK as well, who I promise aren't sponsoring this episode, but they do have a wealth of great books. Another one they have is, it's just called The History Book, and that literally tracks small bite-sized bits of history from human origins, and that goes all the way up to again the modern world as well. It's about 352 pages, but it's well indexed, so again you can find something about everything in there as well, and it's beautifully illustrated as well, one to have in the classroom as well, making references to it all the time to really kind of encourage. This is something that perhaps some children might want to pick up and almost start reading themselves as well.
Yeah, it should probably go without saying that we're not sponsored by anybody, because they'd be expecting a certain level of production quality, I imagine, if we were. History is one that I've got lots written down for. Podcasts, Neil, you've recommended most of them to me, I think. Fall of Civilizations, I put those on as I'm going to sleep. I set a 30-minute timer so I know where the last sort of ish bit I've gotten to was, the short histories. And they've now got a daily thing called History Daily, where they talk about what happened in history on that day. It's only a little 15-minute bite, but it's really interesting as well. Great courses. The most recent one was the Vikings, and it didn't just look at Viking. It looked at Scandinavian peoples between that 300, 400 year period, right down to the time of the Normans and the Rus, and how basically they shaped our lives. And I think Anglo-Saxon history, was shaped immeasurably by that particular period, and to be honest, the modern day as well. Anything by Ian Kershaw on World War II, there's The End, Hitler's Germany, and then he's done a 2-volume sort of biography of Hitler himself, which might not have too many pieces that are directly applicable, but I think the bigger our picture of that period of history, the better. And then this bit's probably the best thing I'll say all night. When I'm looking for really interesting texts with a subject specialist focus, I will type in the name of a university, the subject, and the word reading list. So for instance, tonight I wrote in History of the British Isles reading list, Oxford, and I got Balliol College's list, and they go for everything from 300 to 1500. And so I could literally go, okay, here's what people who are studying this course at Balliol College are engaging with, and then I can choose the bits that stand out to me. So they've got website links. I think I'll try and put some of these in the show notes, but like there's one that really stood out to me. Was it The Stripping of the Altars, Traditional Religion in England, 1400 to 1580, and that's a book from 1992 by E. Duffy. And so I'm going to read that because that looks interesting, and you can almost trust in the level because it's on the recommended or essential reading list of the university.
On the subject of podcasts, to add to that, if I didn't hear them, You're Dead to Me often has elements of the primary curriculum on them. Really interesting one all about Mary Seacole, who quite commonly gets put into the Key Stage 1 curriculum when looking at significant figures. Really excellent. There's Greg Jenner, who is the public historian behind Horrible Histories. He's joined with an expert historian and a comedian as well, probably about 30-40 minutes on average. So there's always something interesting. It's always a bit of a laugh running joke. And what I really appreciate about it is that it's almost done almost like a game show format. So at the end, there is a quiz, a 10-question quiz. So you can almost use that as a cheeky bit of retrieval practice for yourself if you're taking it in to actually learn from it. So fully recommend that one, along with History Extra, Everything and Anything. There's 14 years of back catalogue on History Extra about everything that you will ever need to know. So History Extra and An Ancient Civilization, History Extra, Anglo-Saxons, whatever it might be, you'll find something there for sure.
I'm really pleased you mentioned that, because I will often go there first to the, You're Dead to Me, get like a base level, and then go to other sources after it. And also, Peter Frankopan is quite often one of the guests. He'd be the historian, and obviously he wrote the Silk Roads. There's another Silk Roads book that he's just released, and anything he sort of produces, I try to eat up as much as possible, because he's got this really interesting take on history. And like I say, I think he did. I don't know if it was the Assyrians, but he was definitely there with them with Boudica, I think. And yeah, always really interesting to listen to.
I guess while we're just thinking about that as well, depending on where you are in your kind of curriculum journey, if you're looking for a text, if you're studying different civilizations and you're thinking, right, okay, so now where are some real kind of coherent, links and golden threads that I can kind of weave into this, so they can, really kind of see that history isn't just static units of certain periods, but there is a coherent narrative between them, then I do recommend reading the Book of Knowledge as well, which I know is a firm favorite on the podcast, which really kind of fantastic book that traces the origins of some particular ancient texts. But through that, you get to learn about the Golden Age of Islam and Baghdad. You get to learn about the importance of Alexander, the library at Alexandria, so looking at the latter end of the Egyptian Empire. So it's just a really kind of nice book that you can use to add a few cohesive ties to. But I appreciate that's later down when you're really kind of thinking about how can I really kind of improve this curriculum once you have a solid foundation.
Yeah, I felt I understood world history so much more having read that book. So that would have been about Christmas last year, Christmas 2020. You recommended that book? Yeah, awesome recommendation.
Yeah, I think that's as Chris was saying, it's difficult to get kind of an overview, and I think those kinds of books are actually the one way that you can really get that, where instead of just focusing on one particular period in depth, you're actually tracing something over time. Really kind of gets you to see how everything all links up, and cause and effects to your heart's content with pretty much every event that has ever happened throughout world history.
So the next one might be a bit tricky. What about geography? Where are we going for that?
Just going to recommend one resource. Might seem a little bit out there. I'm sure there's a good chance you'll already be familiar with a YouTube channel called Crash Course by the Vlog Brothers. One of them wrote a book called The Fault in Their Stars. Interesting chat, multi-talented pair. But they're one of the things that they released about a decade ago, I think it's about 10 years old, is a YouTube show called Crash Course that has released title after title after title, series after series. And I think in the last 12 months or so, one that's been released is Geography, an introduction to geography. And it is typically accessible, engaging, and detailed and nuanced. Really, really interesting series. Because they're in 10-minute bites, you end up just watching one and then another one and then another one. And you feel like, oh, well, that was very easily done. And then you look back and you realize that you've been through a 6-hour lecture series effectively on the subject of geography, what it is, how it relates to other subjects, the difference between place and space. It's a terrific. If you only watch one episode, watch the first, just as to get a grasp of what geography is, what it isn't as well. It's highly recommended. It's a cracking little series. There's loads. I could mention Crash Course for lots of the stuff we've talked about already. There's currently a series on Black American history, which is absolutely terrific. There are multiple courses on there that I'd recommend. So Crash Course Geography. That's the one thing I'm going to mention for geography. Nice.
Likewise, I only just have one, but it's some of its parts, and that's the In the Know series from the Geography Association. There are 10 of them all together, but you can buy them. I think it's something like they retail at about $6.99 each if you're not a member, but if you are a member of the Geography Association, I think you can get all 10 for something about £20. And it just takes a few of those kind of highbrow curriculum objectives and just kind of breaks it down very methodically as to what this actually looks like, breaks down the key terminology. What I particularly like about it is that if it was a document that you downloaded, put on your shared area, and just said, these are our geographical definitions, I think that would do a lot of good for geography curriculum, because whenever climate zones come up, whichever website you go to, they always name them some ever so slightly different, whereas this just ensures that there is a clear kind of consistency as to what these definitions are, and this is the language that we're going to be using in the curriculum that the children are going to have going forward. So they have one on climate, biomes and vegetation belts. They got one on earthquakes and tsunamis. They have one on energy, another on grid references and map symbols, one on latitude, longitude, night and day, mountains and volcanoes. So all of the kind of like classic ones, but also resources. There's that particularly nasty objective in the national curriculum about land use and different resources. So this kind of really kind of breaks it down at a level that is understandable to every primary school teacher. I'm sure some great graphics, which I've used to incorporate into our curriculum as well. Definitely worth the investment for £20.
Yeah, for geography, it's well outside my remit, but I play a game called GeoGuessr, and essentially it's got Google Maps or Google Earth built into it, and it plonks you somewhere in the world, and you have to identify on the two-dimensional map where you are, and there are people on YouTube who can guess in milliseconds without moving. Sometimes you'll be in like a desert, and these people know exactly where they are in the world. But in terms of a fun way to familiarize yourself with different parts of the world, I think and countries the size of China, understanding where the different parts of China that we might be talking to pupils about in relation to the distance, where the Great Wall of China is. Whenever I had to guess where that was, and the reality, I think I was thousands of miles away. And so, you're not studying, you're just playing a game. And I think it's on phone. I use the web browser because it's just a bit better in terms of functionality. But you can't beat it for an enjoyable way to familiarize yourself with locations across the world. So in science, Chris, where obviously as a student of science, perhaps I don't know what's the word, a disciple of the scientific. Where are you going to top up your immense subject knowledge?
My science background is a long time ago. It's a long time since I did that chemistry degree, but all the more reason for me to go back and grasp the basics. I'm a big fan of a book called Teaching Primary Science by Peter Riley. It just spells out the absolute basics of the national curriculum, topic by topic, and it goes a bit beyond the national curriculum as well, which is ideal. But it's accessible, isn't intimidating in the slightest. That's my kind of go-to resource, I would say, for science. There are obviously all sorts of other places. I've mentioned like Veritasium and this sort of stuff. There are all sorts of places on YouTube where you can find the things that go far beyond your study. Like things like, again, for a lot of the things we've mentioned in the podcast so far, like In Our Time is a great example of that. But obviously that's going beyond what we need to know for primary science. But for the core of what you do need to know, as I say, Peter Riley's Teaching Primary Science is a really good place to start.
Nice. I have two books that I kind of go to. The first is Michael Allen's Misconceptions in Primary Science. For me personally, I have to look past a little bit the pedagogy. He does have an outline of the kind of the pedagogy that he advocates, which you kind of have to, unless that's the pedagogy that you choose to go down to, of course. But for me, it's not one that I do want to go to. But in terms of the actual misconceptions that students might have, that's a particularly good one. And I really enjoy, and I think I remember, I think it was Lil Okers who recommended this one on Twitter, which is the really useful science book, A Framework of Knowledge for Primary Teachers. And that's by Steve Farrow. it's quite an old text, but obviously, science, while it has moved on, this was first published in 1996. And in fact, the copy that I have was a second-hand copy, and a Wendy Smith did her PGCE in 1997 and 1998, as it's mentioned there in the first book. So if there is a Wendy Smith out there who did their PGCE in 1997 and 1998, yeah, I have your book, so thank you very much. But for primary science, it just breaks down everything that you need to know effectively about the science and subject knowledge that anyone will ever need, as well. Again, some useful diagrams, which would always be useful for teaching as well. So yeah, really recommend that one. It does go beyond the primary element, which I think is no bad thing, but definitely everything that you need there in one book.
I think mine are probably more subject specific. I mean, Brian Cox has a book on the planets. I find it really comprehensive and interesting at the same time. It's almost one of those ones that bridges popularity and science at the same time. And then there are a few great courses. The one called The Mysteries of Modern Science, or Mysteries of Modern Physics, Time. And I know that we don't go in too much into time, but in terms of my understanding of physics, and particularly quantum physics, I just find it really interesting. I think it's one of those things that if we understand it a little bit more, it feeds into our understanding of physics that we teach at the primary phase. And then the theory of evolution, a history of controversy, which is almost like a scientifically historical account, going from Lamarckianism towards neo-Darwinism, and where we are today in terms of how evolution has been sort of refined over time, and the controversies that came with that, particularly in Southern America in the early 20th century. And I think that features quite prominently, if not statutorily, in year 6-ish. And so I think it's definitely somewhere that I would recommend people go, because the better, it doesn't go into the same depths that, for instance, Richard Dawkins might do in The Selfish Gene, but it definitely touches on it. And so it allows us to build up this idea of the distinction between how people thought in the 19th century, before Darwin sort of finally published his work, and our understanding of evolution now. Because I know that, I think it's adaptation it normally comes under the title of, but I think the more we know that it's a little bit more than that, I think the better. So definitely, thoroughly enjoyable. So those are two great courses, and then one book that I would, but science is one of those things that I want to learn as much about as possible. So I'm going on YouTube and watching videos with specific titles.
Just to add on to the courses, Reach Out CPD is another really good one for time poor teachers. It's been developed with Imperial College London and the wonderful Robert Winston, and it just has 30 courses designed for 5 to 11-year-olds, mapped out to the national curriculum, that take about 20 minutes to do. Very short, very concise, always one to look at in the half term before you're about to come up and teach something. Very easy, very digestible, and free as well. All you need is an email, and I fully recommend that your science lead at least makes an account for this particular website.
One more I forgot to mention: cracking book, a short history of nearly everything by Bill Bryson. Lovely way to remind yourself about how wonderful science is. Alongside that, there's I think I might have mentioned it on the podcast before, so apologies for the repetition if I have. Kids version, a really short history of nearly everything, which is a picture book version that just obviously breaks it down into its basics, is one that has been well received by young family members and the children of friends. So that's one to check out as well.
If we're talking science picture books, there's a book called How the Bork Was Made, I think. I'll put it underneath the tweet, but essentially it's like there's these imaginary animals, and all the animals that blended into the environment didn't get eaten. So all the animals started blending into the environment. All the short animals didn't get eaten, and so on and so on. We've had a lot of fun at home looking at that. But I think there's lots of science, just as many as there are maths books that you can sort of help. So maybe in fact it'd be worth looking at those for future episodes. And then we're on to music. Where are you going to, Neil?
I think music is quite a tricky one, but certainly for the element of the music curriculum that requires us to teach students basic notation, for me, you can't go far wrong with the newly introduced ABRSM Discover Music Theory books. You'd only need to buy grade 1 or grade 2. They're workbooks effectively. So the idea is that you would actually have these if you were practicing to do your music theory exams. But in terms of that real kind of basic understanding of how music theory works and understanding notation and what the various symbols in music notation are called, yeah, I think it's a solid one to go to. Also fully recommend that teachers read the annexes and appendices of the model music curriculum. Really interesting detail and breakdown about the various periods of music that you are encouraged to listen to when if you're using the model curriculum, as well as some greater kind of background information regarding various composers and musical genre that that model curriculum covers. Fully recommend giving those a read as well. And if you want to go one step further, and again, to sign up and something you could use in assemblies perhaps, but for your own subject knowledge, is Classical 100, which is also by the ABRSM. It gives you not the top 100 classical songs ever, but it gives you 100 classical songs that you can listen to. You can organize through the related dynamics of music. You could listen to it through a storytelling sequence, but it gives you quite a bit of detail about the composer, when the music was made, the reception that the piece of music had, etc., etc. So those are my kind of 3 that I'd go to.
Can't say I've got anything hugely impressive to add to that. The one thing I'd note is that if you are a school leader listening to this, it's very tempting when you're filling up your school CPD library to think about the pedagogy side of things. But actually, I think a lot of the resources that we've recommended or that have already been recommended here could be well placed in a school CPD library, not just for the subject leaders, but obviously the classroom teachers who may need just that little bit of support with their subject knowledge. So that's something to bear in mind.
I've got 3 courses from the grade courses. And I think this might have been how I got into the grade courses, because I remember having a conversation with a friend and I was saying about how I just didn't understand jazz. I was like, this isn't music. I don't understand. They're just doing this for the sake of doing this. And he said, no, there's a course called Elements of Jazz from Keck Walks to Fusion. He's all, listen to this and then come back to me and we can talk more about this, because you're woefully ill-informed as it stands. And he wasn't prepared to have a conversation with me. And so then I looked at that, and there was one called How to Listen to and Understand Classical Music. And so I think I went through those in a month, the 2 of them. And I had an appreciation for those 2 forms of music beyond what I'd had before, because I was looking at things that they were signposting and then realizing what was happening. And so I don't know how deep we go in music, but I think understanding the decisions of people like Beethoven and Mozart, really helps to understand what we're trying to achieve with them, like musical notation and things like genre and form and tone, all the different things we teach, and then there's one called Concert Masterworks, if you want to go even further, where he basically picks out 5 like symphonies or concertos and talks about why they were so important. So like Neil was saying, how it was received at the time, how this sort of challenged what we thought. The things that come to mind are the fact that there wasn't much time, relatively speaking, between Beethoven and Mozart, but the advent of the piano made what was possible much different, later in the 19th century than it was, towards the end of the 18th century. And hopefully I'm getting those dates right. But so like I say, I don't teach music. I don't think I really taught music properly, despite knowing how to play a couple of instruments, when I was teaching, the full complement. But it's something that I always try to, since that conversation with my friend where he said, you need to improve your knowledge before we can have a proper conversation. but actually it's helped me help others with their music curriculum ambitions, because I've got that sort of background knowledge on the decision and the reasons why people might make the decisions they make. So those 3 courses, I don't think I can state enough how useful they might be.
Just one more to add, which just come to memory, there is the BBC 10 Pieces website. There are, again, the same ideas already mentioned. They've gathered various pieces of music. I think there's actually more than 10 now. But when you click on them, there are resources that accompany each resource. You get information about these. So I'm looking at Sibelius with Finlandia right now. So you get some detail about why Sibelius composed this piece of music, a bit of background information about Sibelius himself, but as well as various resources to go along with that. So it's one step further than just subject knowledge, but also a nice free resource there as well with the subject knowledge built into it.
What about RE?
So this goes back to a previous guest, Adam Smith, who recommended a little history of religion, which was a fascinating little read regarding all various world religions. A wonderful book, fully recommend it as a kind of go-to, get a broad understanding of how different religions have appeared and how they've developed over time. But I also think that another particularly useful subject document is the Living Difference 4, which is an agreed syllabus for Hampshire, the Isle of Wight, Portsmouth and Southampton, but it is free. And if you're looking to really kind of understand sort of what those bigger concepts within the different religions might be, this is your go-to one. They provide very brief breakdowns on things, on what the Buddhist traditions are, the Christian traditions are, the Baha'i traditions, the Sikhs, so all those kind of main religions, they break it down quite neatly. And I think as far as a locally agreed syllabus in terms of RE, if you're a local authority school, then you have to teach your the locally agreed syllabus. The Living Difference is one of the better ones that I've come across, and is definitely worth any RE leader sinking their teeth into. In my giving this is my limited knowledge and expertise in creating any RE curricula, it seems to be particularly useful for the novice RE leader, which I definitely consider myself.
Yeah, I just echo what Neil says in particular about little history of religion. Surprised at how accessible that is. I mean, it's 200 pages, but the way it's set out, it actually works out a kind of 2-hour read at most. And it's one of these rare books where when it comes to subject knowledge, you get about 20 pages in and you think, oh, actually, I'm not really reading this just for subject knowledge. This is just a really entertaining book. Yeah, I mean, even if you're never going to teach RE again, check it out. It's a lovely little book.
That one captured the zeitgeist, because whenever Adam and his episode went live, the number of people who were either tweeting me about that book or had mentioned to me off the cuff, oh yeah, I've read that little history of religion. Yeah, was phenomenal. So I think it speaks to how much that captured people's imaginations, and the job it can do. And then I think we're on to languages. One of those ones that it's in the national curriculum, but many of us aren't necessarily equipped to deliver the lofty ambitions. How do we get better? What do we read or what do we listen to get better at to improve our subject knowledge from the first place, and then get better at teaching languages as a result?
In terms of French, I'd recommend Rachel Hawkes. That's Hawkes. There's a course that runs from kind of year 3, 4, 5, 6, if you choose to follow it that way. It's basic enough for me to get on board with it. So that's fantastic. Again, treading old ground almost here, but I went back to another CGP revision guide. Again, very helpful. CGP GCSE French, first half of one of those, if you studied French, it's going to be really useful as a little reminder. Yes, it will go beyond what you're expected in terms of, past perfect tense, etc., in what you're going to be teaching at primary level. But if you have some understanding of a language from GCSE and you want just to remind yourself of it, do find revision guides are really useful for this.
Not too much to offer here, but I know my preference, and I'm sure I've mentioned it on the podcast before, is for Latin. And so whilst I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you teach Latin without having some form of training, there is kind of plenty of free resources there from the Maximum Classics, which is part of the Classics for All project, which provides free lessons for Key Stage 2, which is easily enough for people to get their head around. Possible to take it as an off-the-shelf scheme of work. As I say, it's all there, it is all comprehensive. Definitely one I'd want to have some CPD from someone who can speak Latin before I'd personally want it delivered, but it is an option out there if that's the route that some schools wish to go to.
I think lots of people bemoan the way they were taught languages at school, but if we have any hope of changing that perceived experience, because it's not for me to comment on the actual quality of language instruction in secondary schools, because my own experiences as a student, and I wasn't a very diligent student during that period. I remember doing my GCSE in Irish, and having covered the Irish when I was younger, sort of switched off, and so I can't really speak with any great confidence on what it's like. But I think the better we know a language, the better equipped we are to instruct others in it. And part of me thinks, well, if I am expected to be the subject leader, is it fair for me to ask my school to pay for languages? Because I do think if you want to learn a language, the most efficient way to do it is through instruction from an expert. But there are places that I go, going full circle. We haven't been full circle for a while. Back to my what you're reading for recommendation. When I think about my methodology and the resources I use, I'd probably start with something. There's an app called Language Transfer, and it's very much a passive listen, take on board. And I think they have 8 languages at the minute, but you literally just listen to maybe 10 minutes. And this guy sort of tries to convince you in that Michelle Thomas kind of way that you already understand the language. You just didn't realize you understood the language. I'm not saying there's any efficacy in that method, but as a primer, that's where I go first. And you get people like Benny Lewis, who he's got his language hacking sort of series of books, and he's definitely got Spanish, French, and German, and he might have an Italian one as well. And essentially, I reckon if you were to complete that course, because it's audio and book, you'd probably have the standard we're expecting 11-year-olds to leave primary school with. For me, language learning is about little and often. 15 minutes a day. Within a year, you could probably get to the end of year 6 level. Within 3 years, you could probably be reasonably conversationally fluent. And then I'd use things like Memrise, which is basically a flashcard software that has AI that works out the distance that you need to revise, the sort of key vocabulary, and then finishing with something like Link, which is LING and then a capital Q. And essentially that's when you get to the phase where you're reading for vocabulary acquisition, and you can highlight the words that you recognize, that you don't recognize, and then it builds it into some flashcard software too. So, maybe it's a pipe dream, but I do think 15 minutes a day, everyone could try. Subject leaders, I don't know where I'm going with this really, but I really enjoy spending my time this way. And I think it's, if we're realistic in terms of the fact that, okay, I've got 4 years to learn this language, I'm going to do 10 minutes a day. I think that's manageable, and it puts us in a better position to teach our children too. I don't know, unless you've chosen Mandarin as your modern foreign language, in which case, good luck, and perhaps close to 10 minutes a day for 25 years, I think. Art and design, Chris, what do you reckon?
For art stuff, I'm going to say one thing that's quite sensible, I think, and one thing that's maybe not so sensible. The sensible one is the aptly titled The Art Book by, I think the publisher is Phaidon, Phaidon. really lovely overview of history of art, movements, artists, etc. It's one of these coffee table books that's just lovely to deal with. You can get like a full scale version, but there's also like a mini version, which is fantastic for CPD library. Again, bit of an out there recommendation. If you don't live near London, the next time you happen to be there, go to the National Gallery. If art isn't your thing, put on some music, put your headphones in, and then just let yourself wander and just say to yourself, I'm only going to stop and have a look at anything that just happens to catch my eye and interest me. But once I've made the decision, I'm going to stop and look at it for a full minute. Don't try and look at everything. I've never had any real joy in an art gallery that way. That's not what it's for, I think. But let yourself wander, let yourself be drawn into particular things. Let yourself just luxuriate in the idea of going, actually, this picture for some unknown reason, completely inexplicable reason, right now on this day, catches my eye, interests me more than the ones that are around it. And have a go at just appreciating some art. So that would be something I would recommend, because it's something that I was never into, and then based on some recommendations from a friend, it became something that I did actually quite enjoy and found really, really relaxing. So something to consider there, two different directions. With regards to the design, so what we're saying, so kind of DT, I'll just quickly mention, if your school doesn't already subscribe to the data, so the D&T Association, that's probably a sensible idea. At some point, your school may have bought the projects on a page stuff. Those resources are really useful just to have a look at if you want to see the breadth of school DT. But yeah, so DT, art, that kind of stuff, those are the places I'd go.
Yeah, far from my area of expertise, and I'm definitely kind of still in that stage that Christopher said, where I find it difficult to be moved by pieces of art. It has happened a few times, but it is something I consciously aware of. I want to get better at. In terms of where teachers can go, there is a series. It's called the 13 series that takes you through various different aspects of art. So there's a book called 13 art movements children should know. There's 13 painters children should know. There are 13 paintings children should know. 13 sculptures children should know. 13 art illusions children should know. There's lots of these in this kind of series. I know I've looked at a few of them before when I was looking at an art curriculum previously in a previous role. As a kind of, I don't know where to start, I think they're a very good place, but as I say, it's predominantly just an initial starting point. I think, as Chris said, you need to look at something, go to these places and really kind of experience it before you can truly kind of appreciate all of it. But I think they're an excellent starting point. With regards to DT, I agree for subject knowledge. The DT Association is also great, but I will just put out a quick shout out for a blog that Aidan Severs did, all about the process of what, as in the processes that a designer would go through. So when you're kind of thinking about that sequence of lessons in DT, it's a really kind of useful blog to really kind of think about that disciplinary aspect, rather to ensure that what we're teaching is actual DT, not just children with a glue gun and a couple of cereal boxes and sticking something together and calling it DT.
It's funny you should mention going to London, because I think, particularly in America, a lot of the art galleries will have virtual tours. And I don't know if they started because of the pandemic or if that was something they did to bring things to a wider audience in general. But I'm almost convinced the Met has a virtual exhibition where you can go through and you can look at things. Tate has really good information, like, for instance, I know they've got some Picasso works, perhaps even, what's the name of the painting with the lady with the sideways face?
Love to Google that one and see what comes up. The name of the painting with the lady with the sideways face.
I mean, knowing Picasso, it's like, which painting of the lady with the sideways face? You type that into Google, you get about 50. I know the one you mean because I studied it with the tears and the
I think they've got her, and you know, I'm going to have to use the QI pronunciation, but they've also got like a biography of Vincent van Gogh or something along those lines, and you know, it explains his career, his life, you know, his lack of success during most of his lifetime, and his artistic style. So if you're looking for background knowledge, you know, I think, you know, at some point between year 1 and year 6, you're going to encounter his work, and you know, I would check out art gallery websites and see what they've got to offer. Most artists also, you know, I was looking at Juan Miro, all his stuff on his website, you know, information about when, why, the different phases. You know, the same can be said for Kandinsky. You know, you're going to find the information's out there. I would just keyword search the artist name, and the first couple of hits are going to be their websites, galleries that house their work, and their websites and the information. And I think sometimes you just put the word kids after it, and you get things that have been designed with children especially in mind, you know. But like you say, I think appreciating art, you know, and certainly I've always been moved whenever Chris has shared the work of Goya with us, you know, maybe not in the most positive way, but it's certainly moving. And yeah, I think it comes from, you know, looking at small pieces and asking yourself, what do you take, and then appreciating the skill it would have taken to get to that stage.
I think when it comes to like being in a gallery, for me, it grows like an appreciation of art for me grows from an initial question that you ask yourself, even if you're not interested at all, and you look at 2 paintings and or 2 sculptures or whatever it might be, and you go, if you were forced to pick one, why do you prefer that one? Why does that one just meet your eye better? Because quite often you'll go, well, actually, yeah, I do like that one more. I don't know why. If I had to have one in my house, or if I had to look at one for a while, I'd rather look at that one. And quite often, if someone then follows that up with a question of, oh, why? You can't put your finger on it. There's no like, it's ineffable. And yet it exists. Something within you allows you this kind of aesthetic judgment between the two, and you don't know where it comes from. It comes from a completely irrational place, or arguably irrational place, and letting that ferment somewhat in a gallery and letting that just grow from there is a really enjoyable experience, particularly because I find it disconnects me from the rational side of me that tends to be a bit overbearing at points.
So I suppose now is probably the best time to introduce our new podcast, Thinking Deeply About Post-War Impressionist Art, featuring Chris and Neil.
Not sure about post-war, but I do know I did particularly enjoy, I think it must have been one of the first lockdowns and one of our early quizzes that we did. I think, Chris, you introduced the Turner's The Slave Ship. Massive fan of that bit of art, and that is one of those rare pieces where, and I think, funnily enough, it's the more I know about the painting, the more interested in the painting I am. So if you hadn't given that little bit of, you know, it was only a couple of sentences, that little bit of background knowledge about what this painting was, I would have been like, yeah, I can appreciate the, you know, that bit of background knowledge that you gave it. Just really made me be like, yeah, that's actually pretty fantastic.
Yeah, and makes you realize that, oh, actually, that's quite a disturbing image for a living room save. Just, I have to say, because you've mentioned Turner, his work was the reason why I think I actually began to be interested in art, and it's the reason I mentioned the National Gallery in particular, because I just happened to notice his particular, what can only be described as impressionistic style, and I recognize his was the first work that I could go, oh well, yeah, that's obviously a Turner. That's obviously a Turner. And yeah, the first artist where I just thought, oh, I just seem to like all of his work, and I've no idea why. And exploring that idea was a lot of fun.
I think they're nice links to make across the curriculum as well. But certainly when we look at volcanoes, when we look at the Romans, we always go to Turner's eruption of Vesuvius as well. That's a cork of a picture.
If you're an art coordinator, primary, secondary, and you haven't got a fairly major focus on Turner, this is just my bias. It's like being an English coordinator and not mentioning Shakespeare. The man is England, one of England's great geniuses. So to not have him in your curriculum would be an interesting choice for me. But that's, excuse the judgment. I just love his work. I love his work.
Different format this week, but I think interesting nonetheless. I think the places that I haven't been that you suggest, and I'm definitely going to go to and check out. Hopefully those listening will too. But all that's left to say is thank you very much, Neil.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
And to everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.